Hey everybody, Jim here. Welcome to 16-Bit Superheroes, the series where I take a nostalgic look back at 16-bit games featuring some of the most popular comic book and animated superheroes of the 90s. And today we're kicking things off with the wall crawler himself in Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage on the SNES. This is a game that I rented about 1,000,000 times as a kid, and I don't think I ever beat it at the time, but it's fun enough that I was always willing to give it another try. It's also one of only 2 games on the SNES to feature a red cartridge, which obviously made it stick out on a rental shelf. The plot is pretty simple. Carnage breaks free from Ravencroft Penitentiary and rounds up some supervillains to wreak havoc on New York, so it's up to Spider-Man, Venom, and a handful of other superheroes to bring down the insane symbiote and his henchmen. The gameplay is that of a fairly straightforward beat-em-up, and this is honestly one of the better games in the genre on the SNES. Way better than games like Rival Turf and Alien vs. Predator anyway. You get to play as both Spider-Man and Venom, and they both have some pretty cool moves at their disposal. But a huge flaw in this game is that it's single-player only. It would be so much more fun if you could play as Spidey and Venom at the same time, but that would have to wait for a later game. Also, Maximum Carnage can be an especially brutal game, which is why I never finished it as a kid. You have limited continues, and the enemy AI can be exceedingly cheap. You can eventually call in other superheroes for assist attacks, but for the most part, it's just you against a legion of bad guys and bad gals, including a whole mess of boss fights with the likes of Shriek, Spider-Man's evil doppelganger, the Demo Goblin, and of course Carnage himself. The secret to beating this game, as it turns out, is finding all of the secret hidden bonus rooms that contain additional health power-ups and some extra lives, which are an absolute must. Without those, I don't think I'd ever be able to get through this game. Those shortcomings aside though, this is a fun and well-made beat-em-up overall, and a good-looking one as well, especially the really cool comic panel cutscenes, which look great. And this is another LJN published game that features some outstanding music, courtesy of the band Green Jelly, who composed the entire soundtrack. So while Maximum Carnage isn't the best 16-bit beat-em-up, it's far from being the worst, and it's probably the best Spider-Man game of this generation of consoles. Next up, we have the original X-Men for the Sega Genesis, and this is a game that I both loved and hated as a kid. On the one hand, it's an action platformer featuring my favorite 90s superheroes, with Gambit and Wolverine being my 2 all-time favorite X-Men. But on the other hand, it's a brutally difficult game that always made me give up within an hour or so. The plot is simple enough. By using a computer virus, Magneto is able to take control of the Danger Room and use it against the X-Men, putting them in all kinds of dangerous and deadly situations, including fights against some of their most powerful adversaries. So you'll find yourself in some recognizable locations from the comics, including the Savage Land and the Shi'ar Empire, and ultimately Asteroid M, where you'll take on Magneto himself. You have 4 X-Men to choose from, plus a handful of others that can be called in for support, and you can swap between any of the 4 playable characters whenever you want, and each of them has unique powers and abilities that make them more useful in certain situations. It all sounds good on paper, but when you're actually playing X-Men, it's clear the execution could have been a lot better. The controls are a bit stiff, the enemies are a real nuisance, and there are pitfalls and traps everywhere. It really makes me appreciate the simplicity of the X-Men arcade game. Sure, it's repetitive, but it's a hell of a lot of fun. X-Men can work as an action platformer, as we'd later find out, but the formula wasn't yet perfected here. Plus, your mutant powers are limited by a power meter, so you have to use them kind of sparingly, which is something that honestly nobody wants. If I'm playing an X-Men game, I want to be able to just go nuts with eye lasers and adamantium claws, you know? Also, this game features the infamous section where you actually had to hit the reset button on your Sega Genesis to continue playing, but it was very easy to actually reset the game and lose all your progress, which would be infuriating. As tough as this game is though, it's actually really short. It never felt short as a kid because I had to restart it so many times, but once you actually know what you're doing, you can finish this game in under 45 minutes, even faster if you're actually good at it. Oddly enough, it gets more fun as you get better, but then it's over way too soon. That aside, this is a decent looking game for 1993, but the sound design is pretty bad, especially when compared to later X-Men games like Clone Wars and Mutant Apocalypse. Anyway, X-Men isn't a perfect game by any stretch, but it's decent, way better than any of the 8-bit games anyway. Just try not to pull your hair out playing it. Next up, since we took a look at a Spider-Man game and an X-Men game, why not both in Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge? And this is another game that I both loved and hated as a kid, and despite how many times I got a game over, which was many, many times, I would always be willing to rent this one again. Almost like I forgot how much it kicked my ass the last time. I'd see that cool cover art sitting on the shelf and I'd be like, okay, let's give this one another go. Just like the two games we just looked at, Arcade's Revenge is a ball-crushingly difficult game, and I never beat it as a kid. As an adult, it's admittedly not quite as difficult as I remember it being, but it's still no walk in the park. It is cool to have both Spider-Man and the X-Men in the same game, but the execution is very flawed. The story begins with Arcade kidnapping a bunch of the X-Men and imprisoning them in Murder World. So once you complete the first stage as Spider-Man, you have 5 different characters to choose from, each with their own unique stages to play through. The real problem here is how weak the game makes each character feel, and it doesn't utilize their powers all that well. Wolverine, for example, is the worst character in the game since he has no range, and it would be nice if he at least had his healing ability to compensate. Or when you're playing as Gambit, you can actually run out of cards, in which case, you're screwed. The worst, though, is definitely Storm. They took an extremely powerful character who can fly and control the weather, and gave her these infuriating water levels to deal with. When you do eventually get to play as Storm in a platforming stage, she's perhaps the best character in the game, but it's short-lived. It's honestly just not how you want a game like this to play, though. You expect the X-Men and Spider-Man to be absolute badasses, but here they're kind of wimpy, honestly. The graphics also kind of suck. I mean, the stages look okay, but the characters are tiny and lack detail. They almost look like they were taken from an 8-bit game, actually. And when villains like the Shocker and Apocalypse show up, they also look quite lame. On the other hand, the soundtrack is awesome, so at least there's that. But overall, this game just feels like a missed opportunity. It's not a terrible game, but it is below average and way too difficult. Marvel games definitely got a lot better once Capcom took up the mantle, but for what it's worth, Arcade Revenge is worth playing at least once. Next up, moving away from Marvel and over to DC, we have Superman for the Sega Genesis. And this is another game that is okay, but feels like a big missed opportunity. It was developed by Sunsoft, who made a ton of great games in the 80s and 90s, and it features one of the most powerful superheroes ever, with a virtually limitless array of superpowers. How could it possibly not be great? Well, one way to ruin it is to drastically underpower Superman. Obviously, a game where you're basically unbeatable would get boring pretty quickly, but here, not only are you beatable, you are very beatable. Almost as though you're not even playing as Superman, but a less powerful guy dressed as Superman. This is an action platformer for the most part, and you are limited to a basic punch and a few superpowers that, just like the X-Men, are limited in use and need to be recharged with power-ups, or they recharge on their own over time. You have a super punch, heat vision, and a spinning attack that you really only ever use to break through floors. You can also damage enemies overhead with kind of a Shoryuken style high jump, but for the most part you'll just be running around punching everything in sight. There are also some flying segments where you use your heat vision exclusively, but I would have loved to have been able to fly and blast bad guys with lasers all throughout the game. So this ends up being yet another brutally difficult game that doesn't make the best use of an iconic superhero. It's beatable, especially with cheat codes, which really come in handy, but it could have been a lot better. This is one game that's actually more fun if you try to speed through it, as stopping to fight every enemy you encounter will likely get you killed. There's also not really much of a plot to this game, unfortunately. It's just a bunch of random bad guys like Brainiac and Metallo causing trouble in Metropolis, and it's up to the Man of Steel to take them down. So not a lot really to get invested in, and definitely lacking the cool cutscenes of Maximum Carnage. On the other hand, this being a Sunsoft game, the visuals are pretty decent and the soundtrack is actually really good. It features a mix of both high energy and some more slow-paced groovy tracks that would feel right at home in a Streets of Rage game. Really good stuff. Honestly, this isn't the worst game ever made. It's playable and it can be fun once you figure out the best way to approach each stage. But as a Superman game, it's pretty weak. Most Superman games honestly suck major ass though, so I'd say we got off light with this one. Finally, to end on a bit of a high note, we've got a bit more of an obscure game, and that's Batman on the PC Engine. Once again developed by Sunsoft. It's based on the '89 movie, and it's radically different from its NES and Genesis counterparts. Those were both awesome action platformers, but for this one, Sunsoft decided to go with sort of a maze action game, and for whatever reason only published it in Japan. So no TurboGrafx version for this one, which is mind-boggling considering how big of a blockbuster this movie was. So, a Batman game where you don't punch or kick anyone, but instead wander around mazes attacking bad guys with batarangs while collecting the various items needed to clear each stage within a limited time. Hitting an enemy with your batarang stuns them, and you can knock them out of the way by simply walking into them. Walk into them when they're not stunned though, and you'll lose a life. That's right, the mighty Batman can be taken down in a single hit. Anyway, the enemies that you knock out will eventually return, so you're never totally safe. And as you progress, you'll contend with a variety of enemies that either move much faster or have ranged attacks, and other obstacles will also stand in your way. While all this is going on, you have to recover various items such as tainted cosmetics or the Joker's parade balloons, eventually culminating with a one-on-one fight with the Joker himself. This is a really odd approach for a Batman game, I must admit, but as it turns out, this game is really fun. I like a good old-fashioned maze game, and you can do a lot worse than this one. Admittedly, it doesn't make Batman seem very powerful, but that can be forgiven when the game actually plays well. The graphics are really simple though, which might turn some people off, but all of the various locations and enemies from the movie are present, and there are even some cutscenes included to move the plot along. Plus, this is a Sunsoft Batman game, so you know it's got an amazing soundtrack. The music here is seriously awesome, and even includes a track from the Batman NES game, which sounds especially cool coming through the PC Engine sound chip. Honestly, this is definitely not the first game that comes to mind when you think '89 Batman. The NES game is one of the best action platformers of its time, and the Genesis game is no slouch either. But this game is surprisingly fun and very well made. If you've never tried it before, I'd highly recommend it because PC Engine Batman is awesome. And that'll do it for this edition of 16-Bit Superheroes. Thanks for watching, and let me know down in the comments, what are your favorite 16-bit superhero games? I'd love to hear from you, and until next time, stay awesome everyone. Goodbye.